"You built nothing," my husband shouted in front of the entire courtroom. But seconds later the judge asked one question that changed everything. And what happened next left everyone speechless. Disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. All characters, names, events, and situations are imaginary and do not represent any real person or real-life incident. The courtroom felt colder than usual that morning, even though it was filled with people. I sat quietly at the wooden table, my hands resting on top of each other, trying not to show how much they were trembling. The faint sound of papers shuffling and low whispers filled the room, but to me everything felt distant, like I was hearing it from far away. This was not how I had imagined my life would look after 12 years of marriage. I had once believed in love, in partnership, in building something meaningful together. Now, I was sitting across from the man who was supposed to stand beside me, not against me. Daniel stood a few feet away, looking confident as ever. He wore the same sharp suit he always chose for important meetings, the same expression that had impressed so many people over the years. To everyone watching, he looked like a successful, composed man who had everything under control. No one could see the truth hidden beneath that calm exterior. No one could see the countless nights I had spent working beside him, the sacrifices I had made, or the silent ways I had supported his rise. The judge had just begun reviewing the case when everything suddenly shifted. Without warning, Daniel pushed his chair back and stood up. The sound echoed sharply across the room, immediately drawing everyone's attention. His face was tense, his jaw clenched tightly, and there was a kind of anger in his eyes that I had seen before. But never this open or but everything. He shouted, his voice loud enough to silence every whisper in the room. She did nothing, not a single thing. For a moment it felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. His words hung heavily in the space, echoing louder than they should have. I could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom shift toward me. Some people looked surprised, others curious, and even seemed to believe him without question. That was the part that hurt the most, not just what he said, but how easily it sounded believable. I didn't move. I didn't react. I kept my posture steady even though inside something was breaking. It wasn't just anger or sadness. It was something deeper, something quieter. It was the realization that the man I had trusted for so many years had just erased my asset a single sentence. 12 years of effort, loyalty, and unseen work reduced to nothing in front of strangers. My mind drifted for a brief second, remembering the early days. Back when everything felt possible, back when Daniel and I used to sit together late at night, planning our future. He would talk about building a company, about becoming successful, about creating a life we could both be proud of. I believed in him completely. I stood beside him when no one else did. I helped him organize his ideas, manage his plans, and keep things running when everything felt uncertain. But none of those moments had witnesses. None of those efforts were visible to the outside world. The courtroom, however, only saw what was on paper. And on paper, everything belonged to him. I slowly lifted my eyes and looked at him. He didn't look back at me. Instead, he stood there as if he had just proven something important, as if his words had already decided the outcome. There was no hesitation in him, no sign of doubt. That confidence told me something very clearly. He truly believed I had nothing to show. The judge remained silent for a few seconds, her expression unreadable. She observed Daniel carefully, then shifted her gaze toward me. There was something different in her eyes, something that didn't match the assumptions filling the room. It wasn't sympathy and it wasn't judgment, it was curiosity. That small detail didn't go unnoticed by me. I realized then that this moment, as painful as it was, might not be the end of my story. It might be the beginning of something else. Still, I said nothing. I didn't defend myself. I let his words settle in the room, let people absorb them, let them form their own opinions. Because I knew something they didn't. The truth doesn't need to shout. Daniel finally sat back down, adjusting his sleeves as if nothing unusual had happened. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something I couldn't hear. Across the room, my own attorney remained calm, simply watching as if he had expected this outburst all along. That gave me a strange sense of reassurance. The tension in the room lingered, thick and uncomfortable. It wasn't just about a divorce anymore. It felt like something bigger had been revealed. Not the truth itself, but the conflict between appearance and reality. I could feel my heartbeat steadying now. The shock of his words was still there, but it was no longer overwhelming me. Instead, it was turning into something else. Something sharper, more focused. A quiet strength began to replace the hurt. For years I had stayed in the background. I had allowed him to take the spotlight, to speak, to lead, to be seen as the one who built everything. I never asked for recognition. I never demanded credit. I thought that was what partnership meant. But now, sitting in that courtroom, I understood something important. Silence can be powerful, but only when it is used at the right time to the outside world. Daniel was everything a person could admire. He had the kind of presence that made people listen the moment he walked into a room. His voice was calm, confident, and convincing. He knew exactly what to say and when to say it. At business events, people gathered around him, eager to hear his ideas. At social gatherings, he was the center of attention, making others laugh, offering advice, and leaving a lasting impression. People often told me how lucky I was to have a husband like him, someone so driven, successful, and seemingly devoted. I used to smile when I heard those words, not because they were completely true, but because correcting them felt unnecessary. It was easier to let people believe the version of our life that looked perfect from the outside. After all, that was the image Daniel had carefully built over the years. He was not just creating a business, he was creating a persona, one that people admired without question. At home, things were quieter, more controlled. Daniel was not loud or openly cruel. He didn't shout or create scenes the way some people might expect. Instead, everything was subtle. Decisions were always presented as logical, as if there was only one reasonable choice and it happened to be his. If I suggested something different, he would listen briefly, then explain why his approach made more sense. Over time, I stopped arguing, not because I agreed with him, but because I grew tired of trying to prove my point. Despite that, I remained deeply involved in his work. In fact, I was involved in ways no one else could see. When the business was just an idea, it was me who helped organize his thoughts into structured plans. I handled schedules, managed early finances, and tracked expenses when money was tight. I researched markets, compared investment options, and helped him avoid risks he didn't even realize existed. Late at night, while others were asleep, we would sit together at the dining table, surrounded by papers and laptops. He would talk and I would listen carefully, asking questions, pointing out gaps, and offering solutions. In those moments, it felt like we were building something together. It felt like a partnership. But as the business began to grow, something slowly started to change. Daniel became busier, more focused on external appearances and bigger opportunities. Meetings increased, travel became frequent, and decisions were made more quickly. At first, I thought this just part of success. Growth demanded more time, more energy, more attention. I supported him without hesitation. Then came the shift that I didn't notice right away. Important decisions started happening without me at first. It was small things, meetings I wasn't informed about, financial moves that were already completed by the time I heard about them. When I asked, Daniel would casually say, "It was urgent," or "I didn't want to bother you." His tone always made it seem harmless, like he was simply trying to protect me from stress. I wanted to believe that, but gradually, I realized that I wasn't being protected, I was being excluded. Even then, I stayed quiet. I convinced myself that my role was still important, even if it wasn't visible. I continued managing what I could, reviewing documents, keeping track of patterns, and offering suggestions whenever he allowed space for them. I told myself that not everything needed recognition, that what mattered was the success we were achieving together. What I didn't realize was that the definition of together had already started to change for him. There were moments, small but significant, that hinted at this shift. During one business dinner, someone asked Daniel how he managed everything so efficiently. He smiled and said, "I've always been good at handling things on my own." It was a simple sentence, said casually, but it stayed with me. I remember looking at him, waiting for him to add something, to acknowledge the work I had done behind the scenes. But he didn't. That was the first time I felt invisible. Still, I didn't confront him. I told myself it wasn't the right moment, that it didn't really matter. But deep down, something had changed. A quiet doubt had begun to grow. The more successful he became, the stronger his image grew in the eyes of others. People admired his independence, his intelligence, his ability to build something from nothing. They saw him as self-made. And because I never spoke up, because I never corrected that image, it became the accepted truth. At home, our conversations became shorter, more practical. The long discussions we once had disappeared. When I tried to bring them back, he seemed distracted, always thinking about the next meeting, the next deal, the next step forward. It was as if the version of us that had built everything together was slowly fading away, replaced by something more distant. I began to notice patterns I had ignored before. The way he dismissed my ideas more quickly. The way he made decisions without consulting me. The way he spoke about the business as if it were entirely his creation. None of it happened suddenly. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first, but once I saw it clearly, I couldn't ignore it anymore. What hurt the most wasn't just being left out. It was realizing that my silence had helped create this version of reality. By stepping back, by choosing not to demand recognition, I had allowed him to take full ownership of something we once shared. And now, sitting in that courtroom, hearing him say that I had done nothing, I understood where that belief had come from. It wasn't just something he said in anger. It was something he had convinced himself was true over time. Because to the world, he was the man who built everything alone, and I was just the woman who stood beside him without a voice. It started with something small, something that didn't seem important at first. A notification on Daniel's phone that he quickly dismissed when I walked into the room. It wasn't unusual for him to receive messages at odd hours, especially with the business growing the way it was. But there was something different about the way he reacted that day. It wasn't just about hiding the screen. It was the tension in his body, the quick shift in his expression. Like he had been caught doing something he couldn't explain. I didn't question him then. I told myself I was overthinking, that stress and long working hours could make anyone act differently, but that moment stayed in my mind longer than it should have. It created a small crack in the trust I had built over the years, and once that crack appeared, everything else started to look different. Over the next few days, I began noticing patterns I had ignored before. Daniel started taking more calls in private, stepping out onto the balcony or moving into another room. When I entered unexpectedly, he would lower his voice or end the call quickly. His phone was always with him now, even in situations where he used to leave it behind without a second thought. It wasn't just one thing. It was a collection of small changes that slowly formed a clear picture. Still, I didn't confront him. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to be sure. I had spent too many years trusting him completely to let doubt take over without proof. So instead of asking questions, I started paying attention. One evening while he was in the shower, his phone lit up again. I wasn't planning to check it. I had never been that kind of person. But something in me shifted at that moment. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was a need to understand what was happening. I picked up the phone. The message on the screen was short, but it was enough. "Did you transfer it today? We can't delay again." My heart started to race. The words didn't sound like anything personal, but they didn't sound like regular business either. There was something secretive about the tone, something urgent and hidden. I hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the phone. I knew his password. He had never changed it, or maybe he didn't think he needed to. What I found inside wasn't just one conversation, it was many. Emails linked to accounts I had never seen before. Messages discussing transactions amounts, and timelines that didn't match any of the financial records I managed. And then there were conversations with someone saved under a simple name. Nothing that would raise suspicion at first glance, but the messages told a different story. They weren't just about money. They were personal, too personal. There were plans, promises, and conversations that went far beyond business. The tone was familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. It was the same tone Daniel used with me years ago, back when everything between us felt real and untouched. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. It felt like time had slowed down, like my mind was trying to process everything at once but couldn't keep up. The room around me felt quiet, too quiet, as if the world itself had to let the truth settle in. Daniel wasn't just hiding money, he was living a second life. I put the phone back exactly where I found it before he came out of the shower. When he walked into the room, he looked normal, relaxed, unaware that anything had changed. He spoke to me the same way he always did, asked simple questions, moved around the room like nothing was different. And I answered in the same way. That was the moment I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. Anger would have been easy, so would shouting, questioning, demanding answers. But I knew that none of that would give me what I needed. If anything, it would only make him more careful, more secretive. I had seen enough to understand that this wasn't something new. This had been happening for a while. If I wanted the truth, I had to be patient. Over the next few weeks, I became someone else without letting it show. On the outside, I remained the same, calm, supportive, unaware. But inside, I was watching everything closely. I started documenting what I could: dates, times, patterns, every unusual transaction, every unexplained movement of money, every message that seemed out of place. I accessed financial records I had once managed openly but now had to reach through different ways. I found accounts linked to Daniel that were never mentioned in our official documents. Money was being moved quietly, in amounts that wouldn't attract immediate attention but added up over time. It wasn't careless. It was planned. That realization hurt more than anything else. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a deliberate choice, repeated again and again. At the same time, I continued observing his behavior. The late-night messages didn't stop. The private calls became more frequent. There were days when he seemed distant, distracted, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. And yet, whenever he looked at me, he acted like everything was normal. I began to understand something important. He believed I would never find out. That belief gave me an advantage. The more confident he became in his secrecy, the more careless he started to get. Small details slipped through. Inconsistencies appeared in his explanations. Dates didn't match. Stories changed slightly each time he told them, and I was there, quietly collecting it all. There were moments when the weight of everything felt overwhelming. Moments when I wanted to stop, to pretend I had never seen those messages, to go back to the version life where ignorance felt easier than truth. But each time that thought came, I reminded myself of what was at stake. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about everything I had helped build, everything that I moved away without my knowledge. By the time the divorce process began, I was no longer the person who had first picked up that phone in shock. I had changed, not outwardly but internally. I had replaced uncertainty with clarity, emotion with strategy. Daniel thought he was in control of the situation, but he had no idea I was already 10 steps ahead. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted after Daniel's outburst, but the proceedings continued as if everything was under control. The judge signaled for order and slowly, the quiet returned. Still, something had changed. His words were now hanging over the room, shaping the way people looked at me, the way they interpreted everything that would follow. I could feel the weight of those assumptions pressing down, but I remained still, focused, and composed. Daniel's lawyer stood up with confidence, adjusting his coat as he stepped forward. His voice was smooth, practiced, and steady, the kind that could easily influence anyone who wasn't paying close attention. He began outlining Daniel's case, presenting him as a hard-working entrepreneur who had built his success through dedication and intelligence. Every sentence painted or imaged Daniel as the creator, the provider, the sole force behind everything that existed. My client, the lawyer said, started from nothing and built a successful business through his own efforts. There is no evidence to suggest that the defendant contributed financially or played any significant role in the company's growth. But the words were carefully chosen, not aggressive, not emotional, but deliberate. Designed to sound reasonable, almost undeniable. I kept my eyes forward, not reacting, interrupting. I had expected this. In fact, I had prepared for it. Stu, hearing it spoken so confidently in front of the judge, in front of everyone, felt different. It was one thing to know what someone would say. It was another to hear it presented as fact. The lawyer continued, referring to documents that showed Daniel as the official owner of the business, the primary account holder, the one whose name appeared on every major asset. On paper, everything supported his argument. There was no visible trace of my involvement, no obvious proof that I had been part of the foundation he now claimed as his own. Around the room, I could sense the quiet agreement forming. People tend to trust what they can see, what they can verify easily, and at that moment everything visible pointed in Daniel's favor. But the truth doesn't always exist on the surface. When the lawyer finally finished, there was a brief pause. The judge leaned back slightly, reviewing her notes. Her expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. Then she turned her attention toward my side of the room. "Does the defense have anything to present?" she asked calmly. My attorney stood up without hesitation. His movements were controlled, his expression composed. He didn't rush, didn't show urgency. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the performance we had just witnessed. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "We would like to submit additional evidence for the court's consideration." There was a subtle shift in the room at those words. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there. A slight tension, a flicker of curiosity. Even Daniel seemed to notice. I saw the faint change in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened just slightly. But then he smiled. It wasn't a genuine smile. It was controlled, almost dismissive, as if he already knew whatever we were about to present wouldn't matter. That expression told me something important. He believed his position was too strong to be challenged. He believed that anything outside of the official documents would be irrelevant. That belief was exactly what we were counting on. My attorney approached the table where the documents were organized. Everything had been prepared carefully, reviewed multiple times, arranged in a way that would reveal the truth step by step. There was no rush because there didn't need to be. Every detail had its place and every piece of evidence had its purpose. "Your Honor," he continued, "the information presented so far reflects only a portion of the reality. What we are about to show will provide a more complete understanding of the financial structure and management behind the business in question." Daniel's lawyer immediately stood up again. "Objection," he said. "This appears to be an attempt to introduce irrelevant material that has no direct connection to the ownership of the company." His tone was sharper this time, less controlled. It was the first sign of resistance, the first indication that something unexpected might be happening. The judge raised her hand slightly, signaling for him to sit down. "I will decide what is relevant," she said firmly. That brief exchange changed the energy in the room. It was no longer just a straightforward presentation. It had become something else. A contest of narratives, a question which version of the truth would hold. My attorney nodded and proceeded without interruption. He began by referencing financial records, not presenting them yet, but establishing their importance. He spoke about patterns, about consistency, about the difference between visible ownership and actual management. His words were precise, carefully constructed to guide the court's attention in a specific direction. I watched Daniel closely during this time. At first, he remained relaxed, leaning back slightly, his expression unchanged. But as the explanation continued, I noticed small shifts. His eyes moved more frequently, his fingers tapped lightly against the table, and the confidence that had once seemed unshakable began to show faint cracks. He still didn't know exactly what was coming. And that uncertainty was beginning to affect him. For me, this was the moment everything started to feel real. All the weeks of quiet observation, all the nights spent organizing documents, all the patience it had taken to hold back instead of reacting, it was all leading to this point. I felt a steady calm settle inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, but clarity. The kind that comes when you know you've done everything you could to prepare, when there is nothing left to second guess. The courtroom remained silent as my attorney prepared to move from explanation to evidence. Every person present seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. Even those who had quietly accepted Daniel's version earlier were now paying closer attention. Because for the first time, there was a possibility that the story they had believed might not be complete. And the game that Daniel thought he had already won was only just beginning. The courtroom felt heavier than before, as if the air itself had thickened with anticipation. Everyone could sense that something important was about to unfold. My attorney stood near the table, his posture calm and steady, while the documents in front of him waited to be revealed. There was no rush in his movements, no sign of pressure. Everything had been prepared for this moment, and now it was time to let the truth speak for itself. The first document appeared on the screen. It was simple, a bank statement. At first glance, it didn't look unusual. Numbers, dates, transactions, just the kind of financial record people see every day. But as my attorney began to explain, the details started to matter. The account shown on the screen was not part of the official records Daniel's lawyer had presented earlier. It was separate, unknown, and completely unmentioned in the initial case. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Daniel's expression didn't change immediately. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his face controlled, as if he had already decided this meant nothing. But I noticed the slight tightening in his jaw, the way his shoulders became just a little more rigid. My attorney didn't stop there. He introduced another statement, then another, each one connected to a different account, each account linked back to Daniel in ways that were clear and undeniable. The pattern began to form quickly. Money had been moving, small amounts at first, then larger ones, transferred between accounts that had never been disclosed. These accounts, my attorney said, his voice steady, were not included in the financial disclosures submitted to this court. The impact of that statement was immediate. Daniel's lawyer stood up abruptly. "This is misleading," he said, his tone sharper than before. "There is no proof that these accounts are relevant to the case." But the confidence in his voice had started to weaken. The judge didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at the screen, reviewing the documents carefully. Her silence carried more weight than any reaction. It forced everyone else to wait, to consider what they were seeing without interruption. My attorney continued, building the narrative step by step. He explained how the accounts were opened, how the transactions were structured, and how the movement of funds followed a consistent pattern. Nothing was random, nothing was accidental. Then came the emails. The shift in the room was immediate. Unlike the bank statements, which required explanation, the emails spoke for themselves. Messages appeared on the screen, showing conversations that Daniel had never expected anyone else to see. They were direct, clear, and impossible to misunderstand. "Did you move the amount we discussed?" One message read, "We need to keep this separate." Another said. The language was careful but revealing. It showed intent, it showed awareness, it showed that these actions were not mistakes but deliberate choices. Daniel's composure began to break, not dramatically, but in small, noticeable ways. His eyes moved more quickly now, scanning the screen, then shifting toward his lawyer as if searching for reassurance. His hands, once still, now rested tightly against the table, fingers pressing into the surface. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "This proves nothing about ownership." His lawyer argued again, but this time, his voice lacked the earlier confidence. "Financial management does not equal contribution." My attorney didn't react to the interruption. He simply waited for the judge's signal to continue. And then, without raising his voice or changing his tone, he introduced the final set of evidence. Detailed records of financial planning, spreadsheets, notes. Strategic are not documents created casually. They showed careful thinking, long-term planning, and a deep understanding of how the business operated. They tracked investments, calculated risks, and mapped out growth in a way that could only come from someone who was deeply involved in the process. "These documents," my attorney said, "were created and maintained by my client." The courtroom fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't just anticipation, it was realization. The image Daniel had presented, the idea that he had built everything alone, was beginning to collapse. Piece by piece, the evidence was revealing a different story, one that showed not just hidden accounts but hidden effort, not just financial movement but financial control. The judge leaned forward slightly, her attention focused entirely on the material in front of her. She asked for clarification on certain details, pointing to specific transactions, specific dates. My attorney answered each question clearly, connecting every point back to the larger picture. Daniel, meanwhile, said nothing. The confidence he had shown earlier was gone. In its place was something quieter, something more uncertain. He no longer looked like the man who had stood up and declared that I had done nothing. He looked like someone who had been caught off guard, someone who had underestimated the situation. And that was the turning point, not because everything had been proven yet, but because the direction of the case had changed. The assumptions that once favored him were no longer secure. The narrative had shifted, and now, every new piece of information would be viewed differently. I sat there watching it all unfold, feeling a strange sense of calm. Not satisfaction, not victory, just clarity. The truth was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, visible to everyone in the room. For years my work had existed quietly, without recognition, without acknowledgement. Now it was being seen for what it truly was, and Daniel could no longer pretend it didn't exist. Because the evidence was saying everything he had tried to deny. The courtroom had gone completely still after the evidence was presented. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of quiet that comes when everyone realizes something important has shifted. The confidence that once filled the room from Daniel's side had faded, replaced by uncertainty that no one could ignore. Even the smallest movements, like the turning of a page or a quiet breath, seemed louder than before. The judge sat upright, her eyes moving slowly between the documents and the people standing before her. She wasn't rushing to speak, and that made the moment even more intense. It was clear she was carefully considering everything she had seen so far. The bank records, the emails, the financial plans. Each piece had added another layer to a story that no longer matched what Daniel had claimed earlier. Then she leaned forward slightly. Her attention shifted toward my attorney, and when she spoke, her voice was calm but precise, cutting through the silence in a way that demanded full attention. Who actually managed the financial structure of this business? It was a simple question, but it carried weight far beyond its words. For a brief moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire courtroom paused to absorb what had just been asked. The question wasn't about ownership on paper. It wasn't about titles or names on documents. It was about control, responsibility, and the truth behind how everything had been built and maintained. My attorney answered without hesitation. My client did, Your Honor. She was responsible for managing accounts, planning investments, and maintaining the financial system that supported the business. His tone remained steady, but there was a quiet certainty in his words. This wasn't speculation, it wasn't an argument. It was a statement supported by everything that had just been shown. The judge nodded slightly, then turned her gaze toward Daniel. Is that accurate? She asked. For the first time since the hearing began, Daniel didn't respond immediately. The pause was short, but it was enough. Enough for everyone to notice, enough for the shift to become undeniable. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. His eyes moved briefly toward the buyer, searching for direction, for something to hold on to. But this time there was no quick answer waiting for him. No confident explanation that could erase what had already been revealed. It's not that simple, he finally said. His voice was lower now, less controlled. The certainty that once defined his words was gone. In its place was hesitation and something else. Something closer to doubt. The judge didn't interrupt him, but her expression didn't change either. She waited, giving him space to explain, to clarify, to defend his earlier claims. But the problem was clear. There was no simple explanation anymore. Everything he had said before, every confident statement about building everything on his own, was now being questioned, not through accusations but through facts. And facts don't react. They don't argue. They simply exist. My attorney stepped forward slightly, adding just enough detail to reinforce the point without overwhelming the moment. The financial decisions reflected in these records were not occasional contributions, he said. They represent consistent, long-term management. This was not assistance. This was responsibility. The words settled into the room with quiet force. Daniel's posture shifted again. He leaned back slightly, as if trying to create distance from the situation, but there was nowhere to go. The focus remained on him, on his response, on the growing gap between what he had claimed and what was now visible. I watched him carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of clarity I had never felt before. This was the moment I had prepared for, not emotionally but strategically. I had known that the truth wouldn't come out through confrontation or argument. It would come out like this. Through questions that couldn't be avoided, through answers that couldn't be shaped fast enough to match the reality already exposed. The judge turned back to the documents for a brief moment, reviewing them again as if confirming what had already become clear. Then her attention returned to the center of the room. There was no need for raised voices or dramatic statements. The shift had already happened. The question she had asked had done more than clarify a detail. It had reframed the entire case. It moved the focus away from surface-level ownership and toward the actual structure behind the business. It forced everyone in the room to reconsider what building something truly meant. Was it the name on the documents? Or the person who ensured everything functioned, grew, and survived over time? Daniel's earlier words now felt distant, almost disconnected from the reality unfolding in front of him. The statement that once sounded so certain, she did nothing, now stood alone, unsupported, weakened by everything that had followed. His lawyer attempted to regain control, stepping in with a brief argument about legal definitions and formal ownership. But even that sounded different now. Less convincing, less certain, because the foundation of their argument had already been shaken. The judge listened, but her focus remained sharp. She wasn't ignoring the legal structure, but she was no longer limited by it either. The broader picture was now visible, and it couldn't be unseen. I felt my breathing steady, my thoughts clear. There was no need to say anything. No need to defend myself. The moment was no longer about proving something. It was about recognizing what had already been proven. Daniel sat quietly, his earlier confidence completely gone, and in that silence, the truth stood stronger than anything he could say. The courtroom felt different as the final moments approached. The tension that had once filled the space was no longer sharp or uncertain. Instead, it had settled into something quieter, something more defined. Everyone present seemed to understand that the direction of the case had already shifted, and now all that remained was for the decision to be spoken aloud. The judge reviewed the documents one last time, her expression calm and focused. She took her time, not rushing through the final details. Every page, every record, every piece of evidence had been considered carefully. The The silence during those moments felt longer than it actually was, stretching out as everyone waited for her to speak. Daniel sat still, his posture no longer confident. The sharp energy he had shown at the beginning was gone, replaced by a controlled stillness that didn't quite hide the tension beneath it. His lawyer leaned slightly toward him, whispering something quietly, but Daniel didn't respond. His attention remained fixed ahead, as if he already understood what was coming. I sat in my place, my hands resting calmly, my mind steady. There was no rush of emotion, no overwhelming sense of victory. What I felt was something simpler and deeper than that, a quiet sense of closure. Not because everything had been resolved yet, but because the truth was no longer hidden. It had been brought into the open, piece by piece, until it could no longer be denied. The judge finally looked up. Her voice, when she began to speak, was clear and measured, carrying across the room without effort. After reviewing the evidence presented, she said, "The court finds that the financial structure and management of the business were not solely handled by the plaintiff." The words were straightforward, but their impact was immediate. Daniel's claim, that he had built everything alone, had been officially challenged and rejected. The records indicate consistent and significant involvement by the defendant in managing financial operations, including investments, account oversight, and strategic planning. Each sentence added weight to what had already been revealed. It wasn't just acknowledgement, it was validation. The work that had once existed quietly, without recognition, was now being formally recognized in the one place where it mattered most. Daniel's lawyer shifted slightly, preparing to respond, but the judge continued without pause. "Furthermore, the existence of undisclosed accounts and financial transfers raises concerns regarding transparency and compliance with disclosure requirements." That part changed everything even more. This wasn't just about contribution anymore. It was about accountability. Daniel's attempt to hide assets, to control the narrative by limiting what was visible, had now become part of the official judgment. The strategy he believed would secure his position had instead weakened it. As a result, the judge continued, "The court will include all identified assets within the scope of the settlement and proceed with an equitable distribution based on the full financial picture." The decision was final. Daniel didn't just lose control of the narrative. He lost control of the outcome. The room remained quiet, but the meaning of what had just happened was clear to everyone present. The assumptions that once supported him had been replaced by facts that supported me. The image he had built so carefully had cracked under the weight of the truth. For a moment no one moved. Then the judge concluded the session, her final words marking the official end of the case. The sound of the gavel was not loud, but it carried a sense of finality that echoed through the room. It was over. People began to gather their belongings, chairs shifted, and quiet conversation started to rise again. The stillness that had held everyone in place slowly faded, replaced by movement and sound. But for me everything felt calm, almost distant, as if I was watching it all from a step removed. I stood up slowly, adjusting my coat, taking a moment before leaving. There was no urgency in my actions, no need to rush out or look back. As I turned toward the exit, I heard Daniel's voice behind me. "Wait." It was the first time he had spoken directly to me since the decision. I paused, but I didn't turn immediately. For a brief second, I considered what he might say. An explanation, an apology, a justification, any of those would have been possible. But I realized something in that moment. None of it mattered anymore. I turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge that I had heard him. When I looked at him, I didn't see the confident man from the beginning of the case. I didn't see the person who had stood up and declared that I had done nothing. I saw someone different, someone quieter, uncertain, and finally aware of the reality he had tried to ignore. There were words in his expression, things he wanted to say but couldn't form quickly enough. Maybe he was searching for a way to explain everything, to regain some part of what he had lost. Maybe he was only now beginning to understand the full consequences of his choices. But I didn't wait to find out. I gave a small, neutral nod and turned back toward the door. Each step felt steady, controlled, and certain. Not because everything had been easy, but because I had faced it all without losing myself. I had remained silent when silence was necessary, and I had spoken through evidence when words were not enough. The hallway outside the courtroom felt brighter, quieter, almost unfamiliar after everything that had happened inside. I walked forward without stopping, without looking back. For years I had lived in a space where my efforts were unseen, where my contributions existed without acknowledgement. I had accepted that role, believing it was part of something larger, something shared. But now that version of my life was behind me. What remained was something stronger. Not just the outcome of a case, but the understanding of my own value, independent of anyone else's recognition. Daniel had believed that I built nothing, but in the end, I built something he could never take away from me. Thank you for watching this story until the very end. If you felt the tension, the twists, and the shocking moments, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of our dramatic storytelling videos. Comment below and tell us what you would have done if you were in this situation. Also, don't forget to share this video with friends who love suspense and real-life drama stories. Stay tuned for more incredible stories, and remember, sometimes the quietest people are the ones preparing the biggest surprises.